that effectively we've been at a stalemate for quite some time. What we should do with the used nuclear fuel that is accumulating at our nation's nuclear reactors. As a starting point, I think we should recognize that nuclear energy is an important part of our country's electric generation mix. I believe it's a vital part of our mix. The large reactors that dot the landscape provide reliable, emissions-free power to communities across our country. Our nation's nuclear industry is critically important, but it also faces a number of challenges, and one that has impacted it since the first reactors began operation is nuclear waste disposition. Beginning with the passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982, Congress has attempted several times to address the back end of the fuel cycle. In an effort to resolve an earlier stalemate, the federal government was supposed to begin taking title to used fuel and moving it to a repository at Yucca Mountain in Nevada beginning in 1998. The federal government's failure to deliver on this promise is now costing taxpayers up to $2 million per day. So this hearing is an opportunity for us to consider our next steps on nuclear waste. Do we continue to delay in the face of stalemate over Yucca, or do we try to find another path forward for used fuel storage, especially for communities that are maintaining sites with only used fuel casks left on hand with the rest of the plant decommissioned? In 2010, then Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu convened the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future to conduct a comprehensive review of policies for managing the back end of the fuel cycle. The Commission's report included a number of recommendations and led to the introduction of the Nuclear Waste Administration Act. Over the years, this legislation has been led by a number of members, including Senators Wyden, Senator Alexander, both on this committee. I've been a sponsor of the legislation all along with Senators Alexander and Senator Feinstein, my partners on the Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee for multiple Congresses now. So we've been at this for a while, and I think it's probably fair to say we'd like to put something behind us at some point in time here sooner rather than later. Our legislation aims to move the process forward so that we can finally move used fuel to a permanent repository. Our bill creates a Nuclear Waste Administration to oversee consent-based siting for interim storage and an additional repository that could be located in states and communities that want it. Our bill also prioritizes the removal of orphaned used fuel at decommissioned reactor sites for temporary storage at consolidated sites. Our bill is S1234. I wish it was as easy as 1, 2, 3, 4. We know it requires some updates and that there are a number of ideas to improve specific sections, so I welcome those. I look forward to the testimony from our distinguished panel this morning, but I would also welcome thoughts and comments from others. Ultimately, I hope we can all agree that it is long past time to figure this out, and the sooner we find a path forward, the better. It's been 6 years now since I and others co-sponsored this legislation. We're in the same place. We're effectively in the same place when it comes to the back end of the fuel cycle as when we introduced that legislation 6 years ago. But in that time, we have seen tremendous progress in the area of nuclear with our advanced nuclear reactors. The United States has the ability to lead the world on some of these technologies, but without a solution on nuclear waste, I believe that we are less likely to realize our full potential there. So we're here today to start, or perhaps we need to say restart, the conversation. I know that Chairman Barrasso has a bill on nuclear waste in his EPW committee. He's keen to move forward on it. I'm glad to see that we've got some renewed interest across Congress to address the challenge. It's a good thing that we've got multiple options on the table. I think this is a positive development, and I sincerely hope that we can move forward on nuclear waste after decades of inaction. And with that, I turn to my ranking member and friend, Senator Manchin.
Chairman Murkowski, thank you for having the hearing on the Nuclear Waste Administration Act, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today who will provide us with ideas of how to move forward and break our nuclear repository impasse. Nuclear energy will continue to be an important part of our nation's energy mix, its reliability, especially in adverse weather, and the fact that it's the nation's largest zero-emission power source means that it is a powerful tool in our fight to mitigate climate change and move towards a zero-emissions economy. We will continue to rely on nuclear, thus we must work on a solution to dispose of nuclear waste. I believe this bill provides a solid foundation to work from, which originated with the Bipartisan Blue Ribbon Commission on America's nuclear future. But I think there's an agreement among us that changes must be made to the current text before moving forward. Providing an equitable policy path forward for site selection is something that I support, as the inequity in the site selection is a large part of the current impasse. Since the National Academy of Sciences' 1957 report recommending deep geologic disposal for highly radioactive waste, it is clear what we need to do with the nuclear waste. The prudent and responsible thing to do is to bury this waste deep in the earth to protect the environment and public for generations to come. Unfortunately, the path to achieve this is not entirely clear. I look forward to hearing from our panel today and from my colleagues, many of whom represent constituencies that deal with nuclear waste on a day-to-day basis. In particular, I want to thank Chairman Murkowski, Senator Cortez Masto, for their ongoing leadership on this issue. If we have learned anything in the past 30 years, it is that social and political concerns need to be taken into account to site and construct a repository. That is not to say that technical considerations are not important, but I trust the highly skilled individuals at the national labs and their partners to solve issues that we will face in constructing storage solutions at whatever site or sites that are selected. What Congress should focus on are the mechanisms that can drive buy-in from communities. Other countries in the world have success by creating an organization that is separate from an agency or governing body, but still regulated by the government, to work with communities to build a repository in their respective backyards. In 1987, Congress decided to not go with the original Nuclear Waste Policy Act language that directed the Department of Energy to characterize several sites and then make a recommendation. Instead, due to the price tag associated with the characterization of several sites, Congress instead legislated the site choice. This action politicized the site selection process while simultaneously discrediting the federal government. It is my hope that following the markup of this bill, it will be equitable in how it considers all sites. So when a site or sites are selected, we know it was a fair process and can move forward accordingly. Let us not forget that there is urgency to this issue. Spent fuel pools as reactors are at capacity, and the need to mitigate carbon emission ensures that reactors will continue to operate in this country for decades to come. On top of that, failing to act means that the federal government is racking up more liability to be paid to the utilities to store this waste in their own private storage facilities adjacent to the reactors. So the taxpayer is on the hook here to the tune of about $2 million a day, with an estimated overall liability of $34.1 billion. Like it or not, this means we already have a de facto interim storage program in this country that is inefficient and lacks cost effectiveness. While we don't have any nuclear waste in West Virginia, nor do we have nuclear reactors, I'm invested in working with my colleagues on this issue because preserving and growing nuclear power is key to addressing the climate crisis. I want to share with you, we had, the chairman and I had an opportunity to spend some time with Bill Gates, and he went through boom, 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 country by country by country that has nuclear power, all going to zero. In a time and era when we want to have zero emissions, something has to be done, and we are at urgent time on this. So once again, I'd like to thank Chairman Murkowski for holding this at the most appropriate time, and I think much needed, not just for the United States of America, but for the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Let's turn now to our panel. We have a very distinguished panel, as I mentioned. We are joined this morning by Maria Korsnick, who is the President and CEO of Nuclear Energy Institute, NEI. You've been before the committee many times. We welcome you back. Mr. Wayne Norton is the Chair for the Decommissioning Plant Coalition Steering Committee, also President and CEO of the Yankee Atomic Electric Company. We appreciate you being here this morning. Stephen Nesbitt is the Chair of the American Nuclear Society Nuclear Waste Policy Task Force. We thank you for your leadership with that important task force. Jeffrey Fettis is the Senior Attorney at Nuclear Climate and Clean Energy Program for the Natural Resource Defense Council, NRDC. We welcome you to the committee. And Dr. John Wagner is with us with one of our national labs. He is the Associate Laboratory Director for Nuclear Science and Technology Directorate at the Idaho National Lab. We appreciate your leadership in these spaces as well. We will begin with you, Ms. Korsnick. If you can provide your comments to the committee, we'd ask that you try to keep your comments to about 5 minutes. Your full statements will be included as part of the record. And when the full panel has concluded, we'll have an opportunity for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm Maria Korsnick, President and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, Chairman Murkowski and Ranking Member Manchin. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony on the Nuclear Waste Administration Act of 2019. NEI sincerely appreciates the committee's deliberate effort to develop an effective federal used fuel management program. Since this bill was first introduced in 2013, several things have changed. Because of a court order, the Department of Energy has reduced the Nuclear Waste Fee Fund to zero. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission technical staff has also completed reviews of the Yucca Mountain licensing application, concluding that Yucca Mountain complies with all regulation. Finally, private initiatives are now underway to develop consolidated storage facilities in 2 states. Nuclear energy is the largest and most efficient source of carbon-free electricity in the United States. Currently, 97 commercial nuclear power plants in 29 states provide nearly 20% of America's electricity and more than half of the emissions-free electricity. These reactors are carbon-free workhorses essential to addressing climate change in any realistic manner. That said, the advanced reactors of tomorrow and the U.S. operating fleet at large are continually subjected to reputational damage because Congress, for 2 decades now, has played politics with the issue of used fuel. It's vitally important that the U.S. remain a global leader in the commercial nuclear arena, and yet we are the only major nuclear nation without a used fuel management program. The U.S. nuclear industry has upheld its end of the bargain at sites in 35 states around the country. Commercial used fuel is safely stored and managed, awaiting pickup by the federal government, which was scheduled for 1998. In addition, the Nuclear Waste Fund, which was set up to finance the development of a national repository, currently has over $41 billion in its coffers, which has been contributed by electricity consumers and nuclear generation companies. Each year, over $1.5 billion more in interest accumulates in the fund, and finally, each day we don't have a solution does cost taxpayer $2.2 million in damages, the single largest liability paid out of the judgment fund year after year. It's really time to solve this, and I'm excited to talk about how that can be achieved. We need a durable used fuel program. We must allow the science, not the politics, to guide us forward. But let me be clear, congressional action is necessary, and 3 important points must be addressed. First, we need to answer on the Yucca Mountain license application. DOE submitted the application to the NRC more than a decade ago, and Congress directed the NRC to issue a decision in 2012. This deadline, like too many, was missed because DOE, without basis, shut down the Yucca Mountain project. For the sake of the communities holding stranded used fuel, wishing to redevelop their sites, we must move forward and allow Nevada's concerns with Yucca Mountain to be heard by NRC's independent administrative judges. This will allow a licensing decision to be determined based on its scientific merits rather than politics. Second, as the licensing process of Yucca Mountain moves forward, interim storage can play an important role in helping move spent fuel away from reactor sites. Moving interim storage in parallel with the Yucca Mountain project helps to alleviate state and local concerns that interim storage will become a de facto disposal facility. This point was highlighted recently in a letter by New Mexico Governor Lujan Grisham. That said, I'm pleased interim storage is addressed in S. 1234, the Nuclear Waste Administration Act. I strongly believe interim storage can be successful if moved in parallel with the Yucca Mountain licensing. And finally, the nuclear industry and electricity consumers around the country have paid their fair share to address the back end of the fuel cycle. But S. 1234 was originally drafted prior to the court-mandated prohibition on the fee, and I want to strongly convey the importance of not prematurely reimposing the nuclear waste fee, especially given the substantial balance and large investment interest which accrues annually. The industry believes that the fee should not be reinstated, until 1, the annual expense for the program's ongoing projects exceed the annual investment income on the fund, and 2, the projected life cycle cost demonstrates that the fee must be reinstated to achieve full cost recovery over the life of the program. The fact that we are here today considering this legislation is a positive step in the right direction, and I sincerely appreciate the committee's motivation to find a durable solution. We look forward to continuing to work with each and every one of you to reach bipartisan consensus on the best approach for long-term management of the nation's used fuel. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Norton, welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and members of the committee. My name is Wayne Norton. I'm the President and CEO of Yankee Atomic Electric Company, with responsibility for Maine Yankee, Connecticut Yankee, and Yankee Row nuclear facilities. The 3 nuclear plants at my sites are fully decommissioned, but for the storage facilities for the spent fuel and greater than Class C waste produced during our operating life. Each company is undergoing litigation with the Department of Energy for monetary damages resulting from its partial breach of contract. To date, the courts have awarded my company's damages of approximately $575 million, claims that now encompass virtually all costs for the management of our companies and the fuel storage facilities. In addition, I serve as the chair of the Decommissioning Plant Coalition Steering Committee. And as such, I want to express our appreciation for this invitation to appear before you today on behalf of the coalition, and would ask that our full statement, excuse me, be read into the part of the record. We are here today in part because the failure of the federal government to make good on its commitment is creating a spent fuel management burden across the increased number of states and localities. This delay in performance by the government has created a situation whereby communities across the nation are becoming the unanticipated home for interim storage of spent nuclear fuel. In New England alone, there are 5 sites in 4 states that are providing indefinite storage of this material, even though the electric ratepayers in that region have met their obligations and paid upwards of $3 billion into the Nuclear Waste Fund. Members of the Decommissioning Plant Coalition have adopted a formal position statement that emphasizes our support for an integrated nuclear waste program that provides for the timely and safe solution to removing this material from our sites. Many of these positions are captured in the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission and in Senate 1234, the Nuclear Waste Administration Act. I'd like to focus on 2 issues relative to the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations and Senate 1234. 1, consolidated interim storage, and 2, funding reform. As suggested by the Blue Ribbon Commission, Senate 1234 calls for a consolidated interim storage program as part of an active repository siting and licensing effort. Given that Congress has not funded the current repository program for almost a decade, given the current federal and state tension relative to the repository program, and given the future funding constraints and mounting taxpayer liabilities, we at the DPC also believe the most effective and timely path to remedy the government's default lies with such a program. We appreciate the fact that Senate 1234 does not prohibit the commencement of fuel movement to CIS facility prior to final action on the repository licensing application. Based on the most credible estimates for this licensing action, it seems clear that a consolidated interim storage facility license will likely be granted first, and the explicit linkage between the two could unduly delay the anticipated title transfer and fuel acceptance, a key to reducing ongoing taxpayer liability. Title IV of Senate 1234 is a clear effort to correct our major policy concern relative to the sufficient and reliable funding of the program. The establishment of a new working capital fund is clear movement in a direction that the DPC supports. However, it does not fully resolve the continued risk of annual appropriations, and perhaps more importantly, it leaves unresolved the matter of $40 billion already funded into the Nuclear Waste Fund. In conclusion, along with many of our other national organizations, which you'll hear from today, the DPC has repeatedly called for the need for urgent action by Congress to establish an integrated national nuclear waste program. Continued inaction is now costing American taxpayers, as you've heard today, approximately $2.2 million a day, and the ratepayers of New England and this nation deserve to see the tens of billions of dollars already collected used for its intended purpose. Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Manchin, and members of the committee, the DPC deeply appreciates your interest in this issue. We are encouraged by your legislative initiative and the attention you have brought through the conduct of this hearing. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. Mr. Nesbitt, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of the American Nuclear Society. ANS represents 10,000 men and women who work every day to provide clean energy, detect and cure cancer through nuclear medicine, develop systems to power deep space exploration, and enable the many other beneficial applications of the atom. We applaud the introduction of the Nuclear Waste Administration Act of 2019 as a serious effort to break the political logjam that prevents the effective management of nuclear waste in the U.S. To the detriment of the American people, the federal government is approaching a decade of inexcusable inaction in this critical area, an impending anniversary that should spur Congress and the administration to action. To be clear, used nuclear fuel is being stored safely today and poses no immediate danger to the public. However, the lack of progress on a geologic repository has clearly endangered nuclear power's potential to address our long-term energy and environmental objectives. In particular, advanced reactor developers, men and women who are earnestly striving to meet global demand for emissions-free, reliable energy, are most impacted by the question, what about the waste? I will turn now to discuss several key provisions of S1234, along with other governmental actions that we believe can begin addressing that very fundamental question. We endorse the initiation of a search for a geologic repository site other than Yucca Mountain as required by Section 306 of the proposed legislation. Make no mistake about it, ANS strongly supports the timely completion of Yucca Mountain licensing. Nevertheless, if Yucca Mountain doesn't become operational, our waste will have to go somewhere. Consolidated interim storage by itself is not the solution, and the country determines a better understanding of what options are realistically available. To enable repository siting, the government needs to update several regulations to reflect scientific advances and lessons learned over the past decades. In particular, the nation's generic environmental standard for geologic repositories, 40 CFR Part 191, lacks transparency, is out of date, and is inconsistent with international guidelines. We endorse a consolidated interim storage program with priority for fuel at shutdown plants as authorized by Section 305. However, Congress should understand that success in this area is unlikely without a credible repository program. ANS supports a new independent entity to manage high-level waste, but has some concerns with a new government agency proposed in Title II of the NWAA. We suggest continued consideration be given to the public corporation model. High-level waste funding reform is essential. Title IV of the bill takes a step in the right direction by improving access to future contributions to the Nuclear Waste Fund. The committee should also consider incorporating practical provisions to allow an empowered management entity to use the existing balance of the fund. The approach to consent-based siting of nuclear waste management facilities described in Sections 305 and 306 appear reasonable. However, it is an open question if a process with all parties having an absolute veto can succeed in our system of government. Additional information on these points and others is provided in my written testimony. In closing, ANS suggests three principles for future action. First, make real progress by focusing on achievable tasks. Create a viable management organization with the necessary resources that can work without undue political interference. Empower that organization to complete Yucca Mountain licensing, investigate a second repository site, and move forward on consolidated interim storage. Initiate the development of up-to-date repository regulations for sites other than Yucca Mountain. Engage with Nevada and other potential host states and communities. Second, seek to combine the concepts of consent and benefit. In addition to money from the Nuclear Waste Fund, the federal government has many means of providing infrastructure improvements, federal land, educational opportunities, and other means of support to states and communities interested in exploring a partnership on the management of nuclear material. Make those potential benefits abundantly clear from the beginning. Third, empower our scientists and engineers. Congress must address the legal and administrative issues associated with nuclear waste. But we will not succeed if we allow politics to overwhelm good science. Act based on real risk, not perceived risk. We must give our best and brightest nuclear professionals the opportunity to take on this challenge with some degree of independence, funding, and flexibility. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify and stand ready to answer your questions. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Nesbitt. Appreciate that. Mr. Fettis, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Murkowski and Ranking Member Manchin and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present NRDC's views. And Chairman Murkowski started the hearing perfectly when she said we're in the same place. We trust this can be a new beginning. With more than 80,000 metric tons of spent fuel and more than half of our states and reactors moving to decommissioning, we need to reset the process. S1234, however, will not solve the current stalemate and won't lead toward workable solutions. Therefore, we oppose it in its current form. For more than 50 years, Congress has offered and even passed bills that would restart the Yucca licensing process or kick open a door in New Mexico or Utah for an interim storage site. In doing those things, S1234 severs any meaningful link between storage and disposal and excludes Nevada from the consent process it sets up. This won't work, and such efforts have failed in Tennessee, in Kansas, Nevada, Utah, and everywhere else. Another such attempt restarts litigation and controversy, and the likely result is the continued stalemate we've been in. 7 years ago, a bipartisan Blue Ribbon Commission keenly described why past attempts failed. That commission wisely asserted we can't keep doing the same thing. Congress must create a process that allows any potential host state to demonstrate consent, or for that matter, non-consent. So rather than spend more of your valuable time on the specifics of why this won't work, they're all in the written, I put before you a durable, meaningful reset of how we can manage and dispose of nuclear waste and how we can really achieve consent. The solution can be summed up simply. Give EPA and the states power under well-established environmental statutes so that they can set the terms for how much and on what conditions they could host a disposal site. Radioactive waste is stranded at sites across the country and will remain so because the Atomic Energy Act treats radioactive waste as a privileged pollutant. The Act preempts the regulatory authority of EPA and the states, exempting radioactivity from hazardous waste law and sizable portions of the Clean Water Act. It ignores the vital role states play in addressing other environmental pollutants. Senator Manchin talked of a mechanism that can drive buy-in. Our government is at its strongest when each player's role is respected. As an example, the years of wrangling over what standards should be set for cleanup at our massively contaminated nuclear weapon sites, such as those in Washington or South Carolina, is made exponentially worse by DOE's self-regulatory status, which the Atomic Energy Act ordains with these exemptions. The same is true with commercial spent fuel, where any state that is targeted to receive nuclear waste looks to be on the hook for the entire burden of the nation's spent fuel. State consent and public acceptance of potential repository sites will never be willingly granted unless and until power on how, when, and where waste is disposed of is shared, rather than decided simply by federal fiat. There's only one way consent can happen consistent with our cooperative federalism. Specifically, Congress can finally remove the Atomic Energy Act's anachronistic exemptions from our bedrock environmental laws. Our hazardous waste and clean water laws must include full authority over radioactivity and nuclear waste facilities so that EPA, and most importantly, the states can assert direct regulatory authority. Removing these exemptions will not magically solve this puzzle and create a final repository, but I think it can work faster than what we have now because it will open a path forward that respects each state rather than offering up the latest one for sacrifice. The Texas and New Mexico events of the last several weeks demonstrate this. Why will NRDC's plan work, and why does this provide a better chance than S1234? Because a state can say no, it can also say yes, and it can set the terms for how it will receive the waste, and importantly, not be on the hook for the entire burden. Because a state can protect its citizens and environment, limit what comes into the state, such a new regime would allow for the thorough technical review on the ability of any site to meet strict protective standards, unlike the years of fighting that have been the hallmark of this process. And just as important, that fundamental sharing of power can result in public acceptance of solutions. We've seen these bills before. Each has been a mirror of the last. It's time to try something that has a proven track record of addressing other controversial topics. If you want to garner the consent the Blue Ribbon Commission deemed necessary, you have to give EPA and the state's regulatory authority under environmental law. It's time to regulate nuclear waste the same way as every other pollutant, with EPA and delegated states taking the lead under our foundational environmental statutes. Thank you again for having me here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fettis. Let's go to views from the Idaho National Lab. Dr. Wagner.
Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and the members of the committee. It's an honor to be here with you today. I want to particularly thank Senators Murkowski, Feinstein, and Alexander for sponsoring this significant legislation and their persistent efforts to make progress on this critically important issue for the nation in general and for nuclear energy in particular. Currently, I oversee INL's nuclear energy research, development, and demonstration efforts, including R&D related to spent nuclear fuel storage, transportation, and disposal. Throughout my career, I've been intimately involved in the technical issues around spent nuclear fuel storage, transportation, and disposal, working in the private sector as well as for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, supporting the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy on these issues, including leading a DOE program to implement the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future recommended near-term actions, which involved laying the groundwork for implementing interim storage as well as the associated transportation to support that. As the nation's nuclear energy research, development, and demonstration laboratory, INL is a leader in the effort to maintain and expand the lives of America's nuclear reactor fleet. These safe, efficient, and high-performing systems produce nearly 20% of the nation's electricity and more than half of our carbon-free electricity. That's more than solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal combined. At INL, we also work with industry on innovative advanced reactor designs. This includes megawatt-scale microreactors, small modular reactors, and a variety of advanced designs that offer the potential for improved performance, greater inherent safety features, and improved applicability for certain market applications, as well as reduced construction, licensing, and operating costs. As this committee heard on April 30th during a discussion on the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, or NELA, a strong and vibrant commercial nuclear industry is vital to the United States environment, power grid reliability and security, economy, and national security. Accordingly, we must address the major impediments to developing and deploying advanced nuclear reactors. Congress, to its credit, has begun this process by passing two important pieces of legislation: the Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act, or NECA, and the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, NEMA, and reintroduced a third, which I referred to earlier, NELA. Now it's time to address the waste issue. An impediment to development of the new advanced reactors, as well as continued operation of the existing plant in some cases. First and foremost, I want to be clear from a technical standpoint, spent nuclear fuel storage and transportation is safe, as evidenced by more than 50 years of safe and secure operations by the public and private sectors. We do not have a spent nuclear fuel safety crisis in this country. We do, however, have issues caused by the lack of a sustained, coherent approach for nuclear waste and not having a final disposition solution. This has resulted in longer than anticipated storage, as you all know, and the national laboratories and industry, in coordination with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, are proactively identifying and addressing the associated potential technical issues with this situation. More worrisome, though, than the relatively minor technical risks of extended storage are the socioeconomic and community impacts resulting from on-site storage at permanently shut down reactor sites. The cost, which has been referred to multiple times this morning already, of approximately $2.2 million per day for taxpayers, which will only increase until the government begins to take possession of the spent fuel, and will also increase as additional existing plants are shut down. And then finally, the negative impact on public acceptance of new nuclear energy, which was also referred to earlier, given the lack of progress to address the waste. In our mission at the Idaho National Laboratory, related to research, development, and demonstration, and ultimate deployment of advanced reactor systems, we frequently encounter this issue of how in the world can we talk about new nuclear reactors when we have not addressed the waste issue. Because of all this, an interim storage facility can be viewed as an economic investment for the nation that addresses these issues and provides a range of other benefits that have been identified in numerous studies, including the BRC report that I referred to earlier. Finally, I'd like to note that I'm encouraged that Senate Bill 1234 identifies defense-related spent fuel under a compliance agreement as a priority at the discretion of the new administrator. The Department of Energy at the INL site is responsible for managing and storing a range of spent fuel, including defense-related spent fuel. This bill would enable a meaningful storage alternative for those materials. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I want to thank you again for your attention to this important issue for our nation, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wagner, and thank each of you for being here this morning and for what you're providing the committee. It's clear that the reviews, the studies, everybody agrees we've got to deal with the permanent in order to get to interim. The discussion about interim sites becoming de facto permanent, that's kind of where we are, unfortunately, around the country, which is a place that I don't think any of us believe is truly acceptable for the long term. We're not the only nation that has nuclear waste to deal with. It's not like this is a case of first impression here. There's been reference, plenty of reference to other nations and how they handle their nuclear waste. Finland and Sweden are held out as good examples of areas where, or countries where they have deep geologic repository siting. They've got a consent-based approach. Mr. Nesbitt, you mentioned in your recommendations to us that there has to be consent and benefit tied together. What have they been able to do successfully that we should be looking to? Are their geologic formations different than ours, and that's what gives them the leg up? Is it more that they do with a consent base? I'm trying to figure out, by looking to others who have been more successful than we have, what we might learn. And I throw that out to anybody here on the panel. Mr. Nesbitt, and then we'll go to Mr. Fettis.
Well, first of all, it's not the geology. The United States is blessed with a vast number of different geologic media which are all suitable for repository development. They have advantages, they have disadvantages, but in a way, it may be a problem that we have so many options available to us. In other countries, they're smaller and they really just have to concentrate on one option. The other thing I'd like to point out is that in those countries that have been successful so far in what you would call a consent-based siting process, they do not have anything that corresponds to the state government in the United States. And that's just the nature of their governmental structure, Sweden and Finland. Mm-hmm. It has been a challenge in the United States siting waste facilities, and typically the hang-up is at the state level.
I would actually agree with a lot of what Mr. Nesbitt just said, so I hope the committee notes that one, we call for, in my written testimony, a return to the USGS had started some superb work at looking at the vast, at over 36 states and dozens of places around the country that have potential. But I would urge the committee to reflect on the fact that, number one, there is no country that has fully cited a deep geologic repository for spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste yet. Sweden, I think, and Finland are farther down the road, but for, in great measure, precisely the reason that Mr. Nesbitt just pointed out, which is they don't have the tripartite system we do of both the community, a state, and the federal government. They don't have that interlocutory layer. And if you want to solve it consistent with our environmental laws, we've always taken a chord of the states. And so that's the basis of my testimony.
Appreciate that. Let me ask you, Mr. Norton, what does it cost to maintain a decommissioned plant that still has used fuel on its site? On average, just give me a range.
Thank you for the question, Senator. At my sites, as you'll see in my written testimony, it's approximately $30 million a year combined between the 3 sites to maintain those facilities and the corporate structure associated with it.
So what is happening on the site right now? I mean, in terms of, you've got workers there that are just ensuring that there's a level of safety. What's costing you $30 million?
Well, the interesting part about our companies, Senator, is that, and Madam Chairman, is that we're also managing our corporations and not just the storage of the spent fuel at our sites. I think if you just looked at spent fuel storage, the cost would be closer to $6.5 million per site. But as the courts have found in our cases, our corporations, single asset utilities, would have gone out of business had the government performed. So not only is our damages including the cost to safely and securely store the fuel, but also to manage our corporations and remain in existence until such time as the government performs.
But about $6.5 million per site on average.
On average.
So in order to transport spent fuel canisters, do you anticipate that upgrades will be required to these sites as you look forward?
Well, I would expect across the nation, Madam Chairman, that there would be upgrades required, and depending on the facility, would depend on the significance of that. For instance, the Department of Energy has been doing studies, pre-planning studies for de-inventorying these sites, and looked at the transportation challenges independent to many of these sites, including the shutdown ones and including my 3. And each one of these sites is unique in those challenges. And so, for instance, at Maine Yankee, there would be minimal upgrades required at the site itself. The de-inventory reports have looked more broadly at the entire transportation route. And I realize that the Department of Energy and others have focused on that issue and should continue to focus on that issue. But the entire transportation pathway needs to be analyzed. So I think it's site-specific, but I am certain that almost every site in the nation would have to have some level of upgrade to stop removing this material from their sites.
I think it's important for us to understand that. Let me turn to Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I think finding a solution to our nation's nuclear waste impasse is critically important. I think you all brought so much expertise to the table, and I appreciate it very much. Instead of asking a question right now at the beginning of my time, I'm going to ask Senator Cortez Masto, since she's been leading this effort and has more skin in the game than any of us sitting here, I'd like for her to explain a little bit what she's trying to achieve right now and how we can be of help.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Manchin, for this opportunity. I know it's rare. Chairman Murkowski, let me just say the recommendations provided by the Blue Ribbon Commission, I believe, do provide us a blueprint to follow, particularly when employing a consent-based method for site selection. My state, and what I'm simply asking, is that the state of Nevada be included in this framework of this legislation, to be treated equally and fairly alongside all the other states. That's all we're asking. And I would like to ask you and Ranking Member Manchin to work with me as this bill proceeds.
Well, that you have my insurance on that, and all of you all, I think, have basically expressed in your opening statements that the site selection has to have a buy-in to where states can either say yay or nay. And I think that's important, but we've got to move forward. Mr. Norton, if I can, I want to go back on Senator Murkowski. I want to understand the economics of what we're dealing with. You all get paid by the federal government for storage on site, since it never did take the responsibility as far as putting it in a repository, correct?
Well, Senator, to be more clear, we have to sue to get that money.
You have to sue to get the money.
Every 5 years, we sue the federal government for the previous 4 years of storage costs, go through the process.
Well, here's what, okay, storage costs. You just said you're suing for and receive $30 million when your actual cost is $6.5.
Well, I'm sorry, again, Senator, I may have confused you. I was trying to be clear. I think the differentiation that the chair asked is the difference between the actual cost to safely and securely store it versus the cost that we have to incur as
well, let me ask you the
total cost. So we have, I'm sorry.
The cost you're incurring right now, you're incurring that cost by keeping on site,
Yeah, we have an on-site storage component to our litigation.
Is it
damages.
safe?
It is
Do you feel it's
absolutely
safe?
It is safe, yes.
And I would assume since it's safe and you're able to do it and we have no incidents there, then there's no urgency, and maybe Congress has drug its feet for 30 years for that reason. It hasn't come of critical mass. And Mr. Wagner, you might want to, Dr. Wagner, you might want to talk on that. Just, would you all consider it's been safe storage? I mean, what the corporations are doing?
Yes, your point is exactly right. It has continued to be safely stored, securely stored, and so
The public is not threat.
Exactly right. So that's kind of a bit of a crux of the problem. We don't have a crisis per se, and in terms of safety or security, as the utility and the private sector has done, an outstanding job in terms of safety and security.
I'm told, I guess, that some of these plants, we have plants coming offline, and we're talking about in climate change, and we're talking about decarbonizing. And Bill Gates raised the bar very high and saying, you think it's bad now, wait for another 5 or 10 years, we're going to zero. We're not going more nuclear decarbonization energy. We're going to less. So is it because you're running out of room? You have no place to store it?
Senator,
your capacity?
No, Senator, it's not because they're running out of room. Dry storage can be improved, and we have a whole set of suggestions on hardened on-site storage that we think would work better while we get a repository program on track along the lines of what the BRC suggested and NRDC's suggestion. And I would urge you, I think it's along footnote 3, your staff can review in our testimony, the actual waste issue, honestly, Senator, has not and is not what is holding up nuclear power's ability to compete in the market. What is holding up nuclear power's ability to compete in the market are its gigantic upfront capital costs. The South Carolina reactors that are now a $9 billion hole in the ground at Summer, and Vogtle, I think, is now pushing $28 billion for 2 new units. The likelihood of building new nuclear power is vanishingly unlikely in this country.
Let me ask this question then. The existing nuclear power we have in the decommissioned units that have gone offline, could they have been restored? Could they have been basically improved upon?
It depends on how they went offline.
The plants that are in the marketplace right now, the merchant plants that you're talking about, they're not shutting down relative to used fuel. Used fuel is a necessary issue that we need to address, and as he
Why are they shutting down?
It plays to building more nuclear plants and people's concerns about creating additional waste when the current waste is not
I think my question is that we're decommissioning some nuclear plants.
That's correct.
Have they run their life cycle?
Not all of them, no.
Could
They're
they
being
be
shut down because in the marketplace right now, the marketplace does not recognize the carbon-free attribute of nuclear.
So there's no value to carbon-free nuclear.
Not in the marketplace. There's not. There should be, and that would help. And
are any of these plants in basically controlled PSCs, or basically they're all merchant?
the ones that are shutting down, for the most part, are merchant. Not all, but for the most part.
And I think we've gone to the DOE asking for some stability in that.
That's correct.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that would be of utmost importance to save some of these plants from going offline.
It would be very helpful.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. And I wanted to, before I turn to Senator Alexander, I wanted to respond to Senator Cortez Masto, because you asked a very direct question of me. Know that I do understand the importance of this issue to you, your delegation, and to your constituency. And I want to be very clear that I'm very open to working on this bill with you, with Senator Manchin, any other senators that are interested in working on it. Senator Alexander, Senator Feinstein, and I introduced this bill understanding that changes are going to be needed to bring it in line with current policies. So I'm aware of the language that you have offered, along with Senator Rosen and Senator Manchin, and that you believe it could improve the bill. So know that I look forward to discussing this language with you as we're moving forward, because I think we all want to find that practical path forward. So I look forward to that. Let me turn to Senator Alexander.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses. Let me see if I can get down to what I think the crux of the problem is. We've got a world concerned about climate change and the effect of carbon emissions on climate change, and 60% of the U.S. electricity that's carbon-free is nuclear power, and 11 nuclear plants are closing by 2025, and most of them will close over the next several years for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons is we have no way to put the waste, no place to put the waste off-site, which the nuclear law requires we do. As a result of that, President Obama had a Blue Ribbon Commission that came up with several ways to move ahead, including a new Yucca Mountain, in effect, a new permanent repository, new interim storage, and there are a couple of private interim storage sites. So there are 4 places to put this waste that we're talking about. Waste that we've collected $40 billion from ratepayers to store, and that we're paying $2.5 million a day of damages because we're not doing what the law says we're supposed to do. Yet we have 4 places that we could, 4 tracks we could follow to do something. We could have a Yucca Mountain open. We could build a new Yucca Mountain. We could have a public interim site, or we could approve a private interim site. Now, the reason we don't have any of those is because some people have said that if you can't do Yucca Mountain, you can't do anything else. So I'm going to ask each one of you, do you agree with that? Ms. Korsnick, do you agree that if we can't agree in the Congress to proceed ahead with Yucca Mountain, that we should stop trying to build a new Yucca Mountain, consent-based, a new public interim site, consent-based, or approving a new private site?
We need a long-term storage answer as well as a short-term.
No, that's not my question is, if we can't do Yucca Mountain, should we stop doing anything else? Should we stop trying anything else?
I think we've spent an awful lot of money on Yucca, and I think it should move forward.
That's not my question. My question is, if we can't do Yucca Mountain, which we haven't been able to do for 35 years, should we stop doing all the other things that this legislation and the Blue Ribbon Commission said we could do?
No, we should move forward.
We should move forward. Mr. Nesbitt, or let me just go down the line. If we can't do Yucca Mountain, should we stop trying any of these other tracks?
Senator, we should not.
I agree, Senator. I also think the country should get a return on the $15 billion that's
Well, my question is, should we stop, if we can't do Yucca Mountain, should we stop trying any other solution?
No, sir, we should not stop trying, but
Yes.
we should complete the licensing.
I agree we should keep trying, and we laid out a pathway in our testimony for you,
Yes.
Senator.
No, sir.
Well, I mean, that's the issue in the appropriations process. I believe we should finish Yucca Mountain. But what happens is the Senate won't agree to fund the next year's funding of Yucca Mountain, which is only to determine whether it's safe or not. And so the House won't agree to move ahead with a new repository, a new public site, a new private interim site. That doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, we ought to try all 4 tracks. That's what the Blue Ribbon Commission said. Let me go to the private site. I think the private site is the site that's most likely to be open first, even if we were to move ahead with Yucca Mountain. Ms. Korsnick, the language of the bill that's proposed has language that was written for Yucca Mountain, which says this act shall not affect any proceeding or any application for a license or permit pending before the commission on the date of enactment of this act. That basically said we're sidestepping Yucca Mountain. We're moving ahead with these permanent repository and public interim sites. But today, that might affect the 2 pending private sites. Would it be your opinion that the bill as written would mean that the provisions of the bill, including the consent-based procedures, wouldn't apply to the pending applications from New Mexico and Texas for a private site?
That's how we read it, that they're already pending applications, so they would be excluded.
Anyone else have an opinion on that?
That's precisely right, Senator. You asked the right question. Texas and New Mexico would both be barred from the consent process, clearly by the terms of the bill.
And I assume from your testimony you think they should be.
We think that would put us in precisely the same stalemate that's put us here for 50
Ms.
years.
Korsnick, in your testimony, you thought the private sites, because of the promise they have, ought to have priority. Is that correct?
We do think they should have priority. The challenge with the private sites right now is they don't want to be the de facto long-term storage, which keeps it connected to a long-term storage answer.
Well, my own view, Madam Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, is that the private sites are our best option, our fastest option. they should have priority, and we should consider whether the consent-based provisions, which apparently do not now apply to them, should, or if they do, whether that would slow down the private sites which hold so much promise. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Senator Alexander, and I truly appreciate your commitment to working and pushing all of us towards solutions here. Senator Heinrich.
Ms. Korsnick, you mentioned that the market right now just doesn't value carbon-free nuclear power. Has NEI endorsed putting a price on carbon as a way to build that value into the market?
Yes, we've had discussions about a variety of ways to value nuclear in the marketplace. In the states, for example, there are zero-emission credits that have been discussed, and we have supported that in New York and Illinois.
But have you endorsed putting a price on carbon as a way to build that in?
Those zero-emission credits
at the
essentially
federal
place
level?
it. We have
National.
Conversations around
You've had
that.
conversations, but you haven't actually taken a position on that.
From a member perspective, there's different views about whether or
No,
not
I get
a price
that. I'm
on
just
carbon
asking
would
what
go
your
forward.
position as an organization is. Has NEI endorsed putting a price on carbon at the federal level?
Not an explicit tax on carbon,
It's
valuing carbon, yes.
Okay, it's not a complicated question. Why shouldn't the pending sites be part of the consent-based approach when we know that not using a consent-based process, which, by the way, the Blue Ribbon Commission was adamant about, has been a path to failure over and over again, as we see in Nevada?
Is your question around Nevada specifically?
No, I'm asking why shouldn't pending applications also be part of a consent-based approach?
Yeah, it was simply reflecting that as written, since it says it's a pending application, that needs to be evaluated because they are
Yeah,
pending
so I'm not asking
applications.
about the legislation. I'm asking, should we use a consent-based process for all applications?
Yes, we're in support of consent-based process for applications.
So, Madam Chair, I guess I'm a little frustrated because we've been doing the same thing over and over for a long time and not getting somewhere. And I'm actually, I've spent enough time in a nuclear reactor when I was getting my engineering degree that I'm actually quite proud of the work that I did in one of the larger research reactors in the country. But I think we've heard local input, state input, consent called just the politics. And I don't think, I think that's a mistake, because the problem is we've ignored the politics for decades. And so one of the things that is very concerning to me is that if we move forward on interim sites, especially if it's without consent, and you have a consolidated storage facility that is filled with waste, and we never build the permanent site, what recourse is the state going to have if a permanent disposal facility is never built? And I think we owe it to this conversation to answer those questions before we expect somebody to, take possession in what would be a permanent, what could effectively be a permanent situation. I want to enter a couple of letters into the record. I have a letter here from Governor Lujan Grisham from New Mexico. I've got a governor from the State Land Commissioner of New Mexico, both objecting to interim storage, and I would just ask consent that they be included in the record for the hearing. Mr. Fettis, what should consent look like?
Consent should look like regulatory authority, as simple as that. To the extent that there has been acceptance in New Mexico of the WIP, Transuranic Geologic Repository, the only operating one in the world.
Why do we have that? Why do we have consent for that?
Only consent, well, it's a little complicated, and it's not nearly the consent that needs to be there, and it's not the full regulatory authority.
But the state
has hazardous waste permitting authority, and the state can shut the place down and set terms by which it can operate, after it had a fire and an explosion that shut it down and contaminated it for several years.
And we reopened that facility, which I will repeat is the only deep geological repository that's been successfully built that I'm aware of in this country because of the state's involvement. And so I think we need to look at that model and look at what you suggested in terms of a different regulatory approach if we're going to get out of doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome.
Senator, if I could interject, I'd just like to point out that I don't agree with Mr. Fettis's intertwining the concept of regulatory authority with consent. I think you can have consent.
But I do.
Okay, fair enough. But I think that the regulatory authority that's present in the United States can be handled in a separate manner. I think that consent goes back to contracts. And if you look at the history of the nuclear waste matter, it is only because the generators of nuclear waste entered into a contract with the federal government that was a two-way contract. You pay money and you get something back, the waste removed from your site, that if it wasn't for that contract, then we would be in even a worse situation than we are today.
Senator Heinrich, I just want to reiterate what I mentioned to Senator Cortez Masto. When we introduced this legislation, we did so knowing that we're laying down a marker for conversation because, quite honestly, we need to restart this. So I appreciate the points that you have raised, and they will be part of this ongoing discussion here. So I want to make sure that colleagues know and understand I don't view this bill as the end-all, be-all, but we got to start or restart at some point. So I thank you for that. Let's go to Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The traditional forms of nuclear energy generated a whole lot more waste than many of the methods that we're talking about at today's hearing. The sheer volume currently in interim storage around the country, and also the lack of a permanent storage or permanent disposal solution are things that are frequently cited as reasons why we shouldn't continue to develop our nation's nuclear energy capabilities. Ms. Korsnick, I've got a question for you. Dr. Wagner mentioned several small reactors. How much more efficiently would these smaller reactors use fuel than reactors in past decades? And could you describe how these new forms of generating nuclear energy could possibly change our need for nuclear waste storage going forward?
Yeah, so I guess as you look forward, there's a variety of different types of small modular reactors that can be built, but some of the types of small modular reactors that can be built would actually be interested in using a different type of fuel, and some of that fuel could be, in fact, what we consider used fuel today. So in any solution set that we put in, we should remind ourselves that we want it to be retrievable. There's 95% still good energy in what we call used fuel. It's just in a different form. And some of these reactors that are being looked at for tomorrow will be able to harvest that energy.
And we'll be able to use it far below that 95% threshold that you described.
That's correct.
How low would they go?
They should be able to use the majority of that good energy. I would say, you know, you'll be down to maybe the 4 to 5% that, quote unquote, that's left that would then need to be stored.
Okay. And that it brings up another topic. I don't know whether that plays into what happens then. Could it be reprocessed or recycled? It's another means of dealing with our need to have a disposal site for our spent fuel. Could be addressed through recycling or reprocessing. Now, it's my understanding that other countries that have relied on nuclear energy recycle their waste, and that the U.S. has even developed the technology to do so here in the United States in a way that's deemed safe and clean. Can you describe the process of how nuclear fuel is recycled and the history of why this process has been banned in the United States?
Sure. So it sort of goes back to when we said there's 95% still good energy in the what we call used fuel. It's transformed, and so instead of being, say, uranium-235, it's turned into uranium-238, or it's turned into plutonium-239. So those isotopes can still release energy, but they not in the current way in our current light water reactors. So in recycling, what you do is you essentially take the fuel apart and you isolate what's good and can be used again, so that uranium, that plutonium, and it can then be mixed, and you can use it in current reactors. That's called MOX fuel. Or you can use it for other types of reactors. So again, it sort of closes the fuel cycle, if you will. You're left with a very small amount that is not useful in a fuel. And France, as an example, reprocesses their fuel. They turn that into a glass, and then you store that inert glass.
So the glass is inert.
That's correct.
It's not fissile at that moment. It's not emitting.
It's radioactive, but it's not useful for fuel, so it's stored in accordance with, it would be in a deep geologic situation, but it would be a very small amount.
So it reduces the overall volume of what's produced.
That's correct.
So why wouldn't we do that?
So in the United States, we've chosen not to. We've chosen the fact that, and this was made in the Carter administration days, that the fact of reprocessing, they look at it as potential proliferation, even though there are many processes and things you could put in place to ensure that it's done without any kind of proliferation concerns. But that's why the United States doesn't currently go for reprocessing today.
So if that decision was made in the Carter administration, we're talking about 40 years ago or more.
That's correct.
What has changed since then that might cause us to need to reconsider that? Has the technology changed in such a way that what was perceived as dangerous would no longer necessarily be deemed dangerous?
Well, I mean, I think we've proven on a lot of fronts that we have the capability of managing significant things. The government manages plutonium on a regular basis, so it obviously can be done and can be done safely.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I'd like to enter into the record an analysis of this bill made by the Nevada Agency for Nuclear Projects and a statement expressing concerns of this bill by my Nevada colleague, Senator Jackie Rosen.
Those will be included as part of the record.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, Senator Alexander had to leave. I do agree with him. I think we need a comprehensive approach here. I think we need to, it's safely stored, what I'm hearing now, spent nuclear fuel, and it is safely stored where it is, but we do need a comprehensive approach for the future. But here's the one thing that I am seeking, and this is why I so respect Senator Alexander. In 1987, I believe it was, Tennessee was able to successfully remove the Oak Ridge facility as an interim storage facility, changed the law, and now in this bill, Tennessee has equally the opportunity to say no like every other state, except Nevada. That's all I'm looking for in my state, is those similar opportunities. Particularly with this bill, it creates an equal consent-based siting process for all states except for Nevada. And let me just highlight for the record, Section 306E requires the potential host state to veto or approve a site before they are fully informed of a site's local impacts prior to initiating a review licensing process. That essentially leaves Yucca Mountain as the default sole repository. Section 506A gives parity to all other states, yet allows Yucca Mountain and other states in New Mexico, Texas, and Utah to be kept on the list without requiring their consent. And Section 509 eliminates the legal 70,000 metric ton limit of waste to be stored at a repository. So if no state wants to be a host, this guarantees all the waste goes to Yucca Mountain. My request is that we all be treated equally. I so appreciate, again, the conversation today. So that's why Jackie Rosen and I have submitted these recommended amendments to the committee to this bill that treats Nevada equally. So let me start with some of the questions and comments that I've heard today. First of all, Mr. Fettis, let me ask you this. If we are to move forward in a comprehensive approach, and I think we've all agreed that we do need that approach, what is the best way to rebuild the American people's confidence in federal government's ability to provide safe, long-term storage of high-level nuclear waste?
I think you've targeted the right issue, Senator, and that is confidence. And I'd also put it as trust. And we certainly support your idea of getting everybody treated equally under the consent. We would take it a step farther in that if we just keep the current system of trying to keep it as consent, everyone will just say no because the entire burden is on. That's what we're trying to build, is a process where states and EPA can have trust and confidence and say yes in our process. And that's the specific point of our testimony.
So, thank you. And Ms. Korsnick, would NEI support the new Nuclear Waste Administration Act, as created in this bill, if the NWA walked away from the Yucca Mountain project and demonstrated that a new repository project could be done more efficiently and rapidly than Yucca Mountain? Yes or no?
Well, I guess I would reflect to say that we believe that Nevada does have a say in the process by continuing with the conversations around Yucca.
That wasn't my question. My question was this. Under this act, would the NEI support this act if the NWA walked away from the Yucca Mountain project and demonstrated that a new repository project could be done more efficiently and rapidly than Yucca Mountain? Would you support that?
I don't see how another process could be done more rapidly with all of the analysis that's already been done on Yucca. But if you found such magic place, yes, we could be supportive.
Well, DOE studies have shown that walking away from Yucca Mountain and starting over with a repository in Salter Shale could save billions of dollars over the life of the facility. So, and this is the challenge I've had. We've had a stalemate over the last 32 years. And we have offered the opportunity to come in and work with us and find a solution for it. And I think you have that today. But unfortunately, what I see from the industry is the same old playbook and not willing to even admit there's an opportunity to move forward. There's not even a willingness to talk about potential new technology that can be utilized to address this safe storage. And that is my concern. We need time now for everybody to come together and move forward on this issue.
We're happy to have those conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Risch.
Well, Madam Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing today. I joined this committee 11 years ago, and we were talking about this then. And unfortunately, the discussion today doesn't sound a whole lot different than it did 11 years ago. It's okay, going to change. Thank you, Madam Chairman. And maybe your bill will get us there. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for inviting Mr. Wagner here. He's really the appropriate person to have here, which I'll address in a second. I'm also sorry that Senator Alexander left, because I was going to say he's the smartest guy on the panel. He left Tennessee and moved to Idaho and worked at Oak Ridge for 17 years, was it, Mr. Wagner? And now working in Idaho.
You're lucky Alexander didn't hear that.
Yeah, he'll hear it. Anyway, it's appropriate that he be here because the Idaho National Laboratory, of course, is the birthplace of nuclear energy in America and in the world, indeed. We still have the 3 light bulbs that we lit, the first 3 light bulbs lit with nuclear energy there. We don't use them regularly, but they're still there. In any event, because they were the birthplace of nuclear energy, the site has been used for decades for various things in the nuclear energy business and in nuclear arms business. We became a waste site for a lot of the waste that was developed during the Cold War. But my point is this. In about the 1970s, the state of Idaho was unhappy with the Department of Energy because they were not properly addressing, in our belief, that the waste should be handled properly. And as a result of that, we in Idaho sued the Department of Energy and eventually entered into a consent decree with the federal government for cleanup at the Idaho National Lab. And all of us who were governor following that stood shoulder to shoulder behind that agreement and have executed that agreement. And the Department of Energy, although recalcitrant at the beginning, has now embraced the agreement. Of course, there's been a lot of turnover with the people that were involved and everything. But the bottom line is this. We have been very successful at the Idaho National Lab as far as cleanup is concerned. We've addressed virtually every problem there successfully. We're not done yet. Isn't that correct, Mr. Wagner? We're a long ways down the road, though. Fair statement.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so it's important that the people and we've had thousands of people, great people over the years from all over the United States, from Idaho, who have worked on this and who are really smart at this. And we've proven that you can deal with nuclear waste, and it can be cleaned up, and it can be put into storage, some semi-permanent, some temporary, but it's been done. So it's discouraging after sitting here all these years and not really having moved the ball very far down the field. We've done that in Idaho, and this is a serious problem. My good friend from New Mexico say we've ignored the politics. Gosh, I would really disagree with that. I mean, it becomes a political issue every time there's a presidential campaign and Nevada's in play. That becomes a political issue. So, and it's also true here. I've seen it over the years as the Senate races develop in Nevada. So, there's got to be a better way of doing this, and I thank you for holding this hearing, and just as Dr. Wagner has done in Idaho, as we've done in Idaho, I think there is a solution, but we're going to have to come together to do it. And hopefully this bill will start the conversation. So thank you so much for the hearing.
Thank you, Senator. And we really don't want this to be deja vu all over again. It's been 3 Congresses now, and in the meantime, whether it's Yankee, whether it doesn't make any difference where you are. We haven't been able to address the longer term issues that must be addressed, and folks are looking to us for that legislative direction. And we've got an obligation to do it, just because it's hard, just because it's politically charged, just because it's expensive. $2.2 million a day. Money. That's just kind of going out the window, isn't helping anybody. Let's go to...
You know, Madam Chairman, you hit on a good note about the fact that we have an obligation to do this. It's discouraging to see that the nuclear energy business is going backwards, as has been described by everybody here, not only in America, but all over the world. People are backing away from nuclear energy, and plants are closing. Some have reached the end of their life, some that haven't. And yet at the same time, there is this tremendous push to try to get carbon out of the air and quit discharging carbon in the air. And look, solar and wind are great generators, but they just don't deliver the load. And at some point in time, the carbon fuels run out, and nuclear is going to be there. It may not be in this century, but future human beings on the planet are going to rely very heavily on nuclear, and it's up to us to come up with this, resolving this bottleneck that is causing us so much problem. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, I appreciate that. I think we all agree that nuclear should be a strong part of our mix, but just as we're seeing facilities that are being shut down, what that then does to the workforce is it too dissipates, and we lose the leadership that we once had. We once used to lead when it came to manufacturing of nuclear components. We've basically ceded that in so many different areas. We can't lose the workforce along with that. Let's go to Senator King.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I experienced and saw a similar thing happen in hydro. Major hydro developments were pretty much done in the 20s. And when we got back into hydro in the 80s, a lot of the expertise was gone. A lot of the engineers, there were very few firms that really knew how to do it. A lot of the technology was stuck in almost a century old. I find this one of the most difficult issues, and I can argue it both ways. Mr. Fettis, you present a appealing plan, state-based, consent-based, Yeah, I haven't finished yet. Don't get excited.
He hasn't got to the butt yet.
State-based, consent-based, getting rid of the exemptions, treating it like other pollutants. However, what if every state says no? Which I think is not unlikely. I lived through in the 80s a effort to even discuss a low-level nuclear site in Maine, and the outcry was unbelievable. What if every state says no? Where are we then?
The same place we are now, and we have to try. Just as Senator Murkowski is, I think, wisely leading this with a very open mind. The reason why everyone has said no repeatedly, no matter who it is, whether it was then Governor Alexander in Tennessee, the fine state of Utah with the PFS site, we actually have a consolidated interim storage facility that's licensed in this country right now that will never receive a gram of waste. And the committee's well aware of that, and it's in Utah. And Senator Hatch helped put a wilderness area in order to block it from ever receiving that waste. The problem, and then I really appreciated the talk of the committee that it's not just about politics. Politics are how we
Politics are an expression of the public will.
Right.
I don't like it when somebody says, we're not going to let politics block these things. That's the public speaking.
I couldn't agree more. And we have to take account of that. And the way we've done that remarkably in this country with all kinds of difficult, controversial issues are through our bedrock environmental statutes, where we have a strong EPA that sets a strong foundational floor of protective standards, and then states have delegated programs, whether it's air, water, something else. If you build a widget factory, Senator King's widget factory, and you have a set of methyl ethyl death that gets emitted from your factory, the state can actually protect its citizens, its environment, its waterways,
okay,
whatever.
But assume for a moment my hypothetical that we can't find a state that says yes. They all say no. Then as you say, we're back where we are now. We've got 80 so-called temporary sites. We've got one in Maine, costing us $10 million a year, costing the ratepayers and the federal government, the ratepayers through the federal government, $10 million a year. That's sort of that's the fallback.
Well, can I do my coda?
You don't have a countdown clock in front of you. You can do it if you can do it quickly.
Super fast.
I'm running out of time.
We have a vastly higher chance of actually having states get to yes if they don't have to take the entire burden. It also solves some of the transportation issues. They can do regional, they can do state.
Well, regional is better than one national anyway because of transportation.
Correct.
The transportation routes to Nevada are, I've seen them. I mean, it's Chicago, Kansas City.
Almost every congressional district. But the idea...
And it would be 2 or 3 trains a week for years to take care of what we've got.
Yep.
Okay.
Senator, if I could interject.
Yes.
Part of the problem with consent is who consents. If you look at the current situation in Nevada right now, the people who live closest to the repository have expressed their political consent for the facility there. But when you add...
I think the lady sits next to me knows more about what the people of Nevada feel about
I understand that, but what I was going to add is when you add the additional level of government in between at the state level, it becomes very difficult, and no one in the world has solved that conundrum to date.
Well, and I understand that. That's why I asked my question. What if everyone says no? And because I don't think that's totally unlikely. Let me ask a wholly different question, a technical question. Why is it that we're talking about now, forever, and always deep holes, mines? We've got these sites around the country, like at Maine Yankee, that you all have said are safe. Why not use an interim technology instead of we've got to solve it forever, something that will allow technology to develop over the next 20 to 30 years and yet still be safe at a more centralized site? It bothers me that we've got 80 sites. I don't think that's very secure.
I think there's a couple of things there, Senator. One is that if you don't have a permanent solution, the ability to convince a particular location, as we've talked about at this hearing, to accept all this waste.
But if the Maine Yankee site is safe, why not a larger, similar site that has the same technology? You're telling me everybody says is safe as an interim step until we figure out what the best... I don't understand why we have to go from 80 temporary to permanent. Isn't there a step in between the
Well, that's what
technological fees?
consolidated interim storage is.
That's what I'm talking
Yeah, and the challenge is nobody wants to sign up for consolidated interim storage. You mentioned New Mexico. Governor just recently wrote a letter. The last New Mexico governor was in support of interim storage, the current New Mexico governor not. And the challenge is because they don't want to become the long-term repository. And until there is an idea of a long-term repository, anybody that raises their hands for that consolidated interim storage is de facto the long-term.
I think that's a good point, because these temporary sites are now the de facto long-term sites.
That's correct.
And Senator, though, the actual problem we also face, and the Obama administration tried to look at deep borehole disposal in South Dakota towards the end of its second term, and it turned into an absolute debacle where this is red state South Dakota was objecting. And it gets precisely to the reasons that we've articulated today, which is that when you're outside of the major functions or the normal functioning of environmental law, states have no control. So South Dakota erupted just as New Mexico has, just as Nevada has been fighting for 35 years. And when you don't fix the institutional framework to allow the process to get to yes, we're never going to solve this.
But I think it's important to recognize that a private company did conduct deep drill hole tests successfully. And I think what that points to is the need to get the management of the waste program away from the Department of Energy and put it into a single purpose,
which is what you're suggesting,
focused organization that is dedicated to actual success. And we have submitted in our comments, in our testimony, comments along those lines.
Well,
but I think it does, there is hope. The bill
makes sense, but it bothers me that, as I understand it, the bill essentially says this is the way we're going to proceed, except Yucca Mountain still on a different track that doesn't require consent. Anyway, Madam Chairman, thank you. This is a very important hearing. I appreciate your conducting it.
No, thank you, Senator King. I'm going to turn to Senator Manchin. He's got to excuse himself from the committee here.
I do, and I appreciate it so much. I just want to have clarification because something's not making a lot of sense to me. You're telling me we're not filled up on site right now, so wherever the nuclear plants are, they're still able to have capacity to keep that storage there. Is that accurate?
Senator, we can continue to expand on-site storage as needed.
So, okay, so we're not at critical mass there. And I kind of thought we were. I was led to believe that we had to do something immediately.
We are in the pools at several sites, Senator.
Okay.
In the spent fuel pools.
If I could, Senator, what I'd like to add to that, however, is if you've got sites like mine where the reactor is fully decommissioned, all the spent fuel that's ever going to be generated at that site has been generated at that site, and yet we sit there loaded, ready to be transported, waiting for some resolution.
I understand. I'm going to get right to that next, because now you're talking about going to interim sites. That doesn't make any sense to me at all, because an interim site has to be transported again to a permanent site.
Well, Senator, I would like to add, and in my testimony, I pointed this out, I'd like to note the difference between perceived risk and actual risk. And transportation of nuclear material is an area where the perceived risk is orders of magnitude greater than the actual risk.
No, the only thing I'm saying is it looks like you're just creating a business model for the interim, since we've got to get to permanent. So why would you have us paying privately?
It's really,
the advantage of interim is an economy of scale.
It's just a timing issue. If you decided today on a long-term repository site, by the time you license it, let's just select Yucca since we've talked about it, that would still be another 3 to 5 years just to license it today, because all of the analysis has been done. And there's additional hearings that have to happen. Nevada has to have their say.
But if we're not at capacity, why would we have an interim site? If it's going to be 3 to 5 years?
That's just to get your license. It's going to be another decade to build it. All right? So you're already talking, you have 15 years if you were on go today. $35 billion is what your obligation is today, and in 15 years, it's going to be closer to $50 billion. So you have to manage the liability that you are building on a daily basis, and the best way to help manage that liability is that interim storage, because once you start taking that fuel off site, eventually that judgment fund comes down because you don't have to pay the judgment fee because you've taken the fuel in an interim state.
How far along are we on permitting the interim sites?
You're nowhere.
So whether we started today with interim or permanent, it's the same timetable.
There's 2 sites that have applications in, but you know, whether they will actually go forward and construct those sites is an open question.
Senator, there are applications, but as Senator Heinrich just entered into the record, there will be a ferocious pushback for all the reasons that I've articulated today. And I couldn't agree more with the lack of wisdom of pursuing an interim site that's likely to become a de facto repository that doesn't solve what you and Senator Murkowski are trying to solve, which is the long-term trajectory of how to solve this.
Senator, the advantage of an interim site is that if you provide security and monitoring at one location versus dozens of locations, there are economies of scale advantages for doing that if you're going to do it for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for having this important hearing. I can say for the state of Washington, there's probably no more important discussion than the cleanup and disposal of high-level nuclear waste. And for a state that did what it was asked of us, and the people that were there in the development of Hanford, to the people who have done their best at cleanup, we too want to get answers to this. I guess I've been listening to most of the hearing, in and out of other things, but I agree with Senator Alexander that moving forward is a very necessary and positive thing. And I would say that count me in the camp of the belief that consensus-based approaches are more likely to generate quicker results than the legal and long process that we have seen to continue to play out. So, and that is even to say, if you pass legislation, it just doesn't mean you've cleared the legal hurdles that continue to stymie us in these debates. So, one of the things that Senator Alexander and others have referred to, and some of the witnesses have, had the Blue Ribbon Committee and their discussion. Our former colleague, the late Senator Pete Domenici, a member of that. One of the things that I liked about the Commission recommendations was that they thought that separating commercial and defense waste and dealing with that separately might be one of those near-term opportunities to make more progress. Mr. Fettis or anybody else, do you have a thought on continuing to look at that as a path forward?
I think that's a secondary issue, Senator, because I think fixing
Well, it's not secondary to us because we're the ones waiting.
No.
And I forgot to put the big moniker out here. This is the largest nuclear waste cleanup site in the entire world.
Agreed.
It's complex, it's hard, we're making progress, but we need to get the high-level waste out. So let's come up with a process of moving the defense waste out. The complexity of Senator Feinstein's concerns on the commercial side are going to take us a long time to figure out. So just like Hanford is cleaning up some easy to clean up things and getting to the harder things, why can't we move forward on defense?
I think the challenge with the defense waste getting to a repository is going to be the same as the challenge with commercial spent nuclear fuel, that if you don't have the statutory and regulatory process that can allow consent and getting to yes, you won't solve it. That's why I'm in it.
Well, I'm saying, we're saying the same thing. I want a consent process that's faster, and if they will take that, I'm just saying streamline defense so it can get done faster as you deal with all the other aspects.
If you can get all the waste out of the tanks and get it vitrified and get it ready, that would be great.
Well, this is, believe me, a day-to-day task for us in the state of Washington, but we're only doing it on behalf of the entire United States and part of stewardship. This should be every member of this committee's responsibility. This is a responsibility of the United States of America, not just the state of Washington or our environmental director. But I will tell you, as we fight every time on some idea that is shortchanging the cleanup process or an idea, we are desperate to move the defense waste in a way in which people are saying to us, we want it. And we will take it. And we want to explore those ideas and see if we can't move forward. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Campbell. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. It's good to be here. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Manchin for holding this important hearing this morning. This Congress, this committee has discussed exciting and innovative ways to address climate change. We've explored carbon capture technologies, renewable resources, and advanced nuclear power and nuclear energy. In several of the hearings, witnesses have stressed that nuclear energy is an essential part of our clean energy portfolio. If we are serious about addressing climate change, we must be serious about preserving and expanding the use of nuclear energy. Cannot do it without nuclear energy. So the lack of nuclear waste management program limits the use and the expansion of nuclear power. In May, I chaired an Environment and Public Works Committee hearing on my discussion draft legislation that would complement and could complement Senator Murkowski and Senator Alexander's nuclear waste legislation. Now, 8 states right now have new bans on new nuclear until Washington permanently disposes of nuclear waste. Communities across the country are struggling to accept new nuclear plants because there is no permanent pathway to remove the nuclear waste. So I'm glad this committee is holding this hearing to address these challenges. So Ms. Korsnick and Mr. Nesbitt, so American ratepayers have now paid about $15 billion to cite, to study, and to design a repository for the Yucca Mountain site. And of this funding, $200 million was paid to the state of Nevada to develop their own scientific and technical analysis. So, Ms. Korsnick, why is it important for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to complete the independent safety review of the proposed Yucca Mountain repository?
Well, you just mentioned the significant money that has been expended. We should have a fair hearing and, quite frankly, give Nevada a chance to have their hearing. The process will require that it goes through the judges, et cetera, through the licensing process. And for all this money that has been expended, let's understand the science and the licensing process and work ourselves through it. In the future, we might need another long-term repository. So let's learn everything that we can and understand the science and the licensing process for the one that's so far along.
And following up on that, Mr. Korsnick, it's why is it? Mr. Nesbitt, why is it important?
I knew what you meant.
Okay. You note that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Yucca Mountain licensing review is valuable. It's valuable to inform safety regulations for a different repository site. So is it also important to complete the pending licensing process to build that public trust?
Absolutely. I agree with everything that Ms. Korsnick said. There's other reasons why it is beneficial for the American people to go forward and complete the licensing, even if Yucca Mountain isn't built. I mean, we don't know what the answer is until we do it. I mean, if something is found that said this is not the right place to do it, we've got to go find another solution. But we need to go through the process in order to demonstrate the ability to license a geological repository for use, fuel, and high-level radioactive waste here in the United States. We're going to learn a great number of lessons from that. And having invested $15 billion already, I think it only makes sense to get a little more return for that huge investment. And the only other thing I'll say along those lines is it is the law that we do that. And I think that if we demonstrate that we're going to follow the law here, if we change the law and do something different later, then people will believe that we'll follow the law there too.
Okay. And along those lines, back to you, Ms. Korsnick, like Senator Murkowski's bill, my nuclear waste discussion draft allows the Secretary of Energy to partner with private companies to store spent nuclear fuel on an interim basis. Mr. Nesbitt just taught other sites. The draft requires the interim storage program to proceed at the same time as a Nuclear Regulatory Commission's review of the Yucca Mountain license application. So do you support a requirement that interim storage is connected to tangible action on a permanent repository for nuclear waste?
Yes, and in fact, we think it enables that interim storage because people will see, all right, you have this path for a long-term answer. I'm happy to participate in your shorter-term answer because I understand that this pathway exists.
And finally, to Dr. Wagner, if I could, the Idaho National Lab is a leader, a real leader in developing advanced nuclear technologies. It's also the proposed site of the nation's first small modular reactor, which is going to provide nuclear power to the Intermountain West. You know, advanced nuclear reactors can increase safety, I believe, can decrease costs, can reduce the amount of nuclear waste. So while advanced nuclear can reduce nuclear waste, will there still be nuclear waste products that must be permanently disposed of?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. There's a variety of advanced reactor concepts that can significantly increase fuel utilization. There's also different concepts that Maria spoke about earlier that close the nuclear fuel cycle through reprocessing. But at the end of the day, there are always going to be some small amount of material that requires deep geological repository.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I was going to ask a question about what What's the number? How many additional storage facilities, long-term repositories do we need? And as I'm thinking about that, it's like, well, we don't know because of exactly what you have said, Mr. Wagner, moving forward. What will the future of nuclear bring to us in terms of advanced nuclear and the prospect for less waste? We've talked about reprocessing. I think we know what we know today, but the innovation I think that is out there is still evolving, if you will. The view into the deep boreholes. We may be looking at Yucca as, okay, this is the design for what we needed 20 years ago, but is it the design that we need going forward? And so I think we need to factor that into the calculus. The question for those of you who have looked at the legislation that we've laid down here as basically as our working document, do you think we do enough in this proposed legislation to be specific about the type of research and development that DOE or the administration needs to move forward on? Do we need to do more in that? We've been talking so much about this whole consent based process and the interim and moving to permanent. We haven't really talked about some of the context of this bill that can move the industry forward. Do we have enough in there? Do we need to do more? Mr. Norton?
Yes, Senator, if I could. Madam Chairman, a couple things I wanted to reflect on in your question. And I had this conversation with Maria's predecessor, Marv Fertel, probably 6 or 7 years ago, when my sites and the other decommissioning plant coalition sites, at the time there was 5 of us, were kind of the poster children of this problem, right? We've operated the plant, we've decommissioned the plant, we're waiting. And I told him at that point in time there was less focus on it, both at NEI and the industry than there is today. But I did tell him on the path we're at then, and potentially the path we're on now, more than 50% of our nuclear fleet will be in the same condition I'm in before we solve this problem if we keep trying the same thing we've been trying for the last 20 years. And I don't think he believed me, but if he was watching it today, with the number of plants that have either shut down or announced shutdown, my estimate's not going to be far off, even if we get moving from here. And so it is a clear problem. It is a clear issue. I think Senate 1234, although we have comments and would make recommendations on changes, is a good starting point for us to work together to figure out how to resolve this problem, because what we have been doing for the last 20 years is not going to work. And would also like to acknowledge my senator from Maine, Senator King, and his question about, are we really thinking about this the right way? And I think that needs to be asked. And I know there's scientists and others that may have a difference of opinion here. But I do think we have to challenge ourselves as to, did we really plot the right course with our original plan for repository, and is there an alternative way to think about this by consolidating this waste, looking at either reprocessing or other technical advancements, other options that other countries are looking at, and take the blinders off and look at this more holistically.
Appreciate that. Mr.
Senator,
Sorry.
Senator, I'd just like to add a couple of things. One is American Nuclear Society does support continued research into advanced nuclear energy systems and advanced waste management techniques. There's actually private companies out there that are working in this area as well. I think the question of where that needs to reside, whether it's in your bill or in other legislation, is a good question. I think the work that John Wagner and others are doing at Idaho is they are looking at advanced energy systems in a holistic manner that includes the waste management issue, and I think they need to continue that work.
Got it. Mr. Fettis?
And, Senator, the Blue Ribbon Commission wisely cautioned against trusting in reprocessing as any meaningful solution for our nuclear waste. And the off-ramp, it's past time for the off-ramp on recycling of spent fuel in this country. It's both dangerous, proliferation and security concerns. It creates more waste, and it will not solve the waste problem. And no country has used it to solve their waste problem. And most of all, it's economical, and the BRC identified that it likely never will be.
Dr. Wagner, you want to comment to that?
I just comment that, yeah, we don't currently recycle because it's not economical. One of the many benefits talked about with respect to consolidated interim storage is that whether in time it becomes economical with the substantial growth in nuclear energy or other technologies for waste disposal and design of repositories come into play, a consolidated interim storage facility allows you to make progress to move forward on this issue while some of those other things may or may not come to be other options for the material.
Appreciate that. We've just had a vote start. I'd like to allow my colleagues an opportunity for a last word if they would like. Senator Cortez Masto?
Actually, I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Nesbitt, I've sat here and listened to you. Thank you for being here. The arguments you make are the same arguments I've heard for the last 30 years from the industry. But you make one argument that talks about Yucca Mountain being utilized to learn from the science, and that's why it should move forward. And I think we should learn from the science from Yucca Mountain because there are no natural barriers or man-made barriers that make it safe. But we keep hearing that all the time. So let me ask you this. If we were to learn from the science of Yucca Mountain, which would require still 40 more miles of tunnel to dig the tunnel, to bury the canisters, which, by the way, the same canisters that are utilized for Yucca Mountain in the study can't be utilized because the industry doesn't use the same type of canisters. But what I'm told, it is so hot once it's stored, and it leaks like a sieve because the hydrology shows already in the exploratory tunnel that it leaks like a sieve, that once the canisters are there, titanium drip shields will have to be created to put over the canisters. And by the way, those titanium drip shields would not be placed in that facility once the canister's here till 90 years later, and it cannot be placed by man in there, so you have to build the robotics to put the titanium drip shields to protect the water that goes down into the canisters that would go into the aquifer below. Is that the science you're saying that you would learn from, that you should not have in any other repository?
What I was referring to, Senator, was completing the licensing process and having the concerns such as you just expressed evaluated by a panel of experts and ruled on in a manner that we can learn from them if indeed we go on to develop other repositories elsewhere.
Why do we need that if we already have the information? And that's my point.
Well, Senator, I don't agree with your concern.
We spent $19 billion on a 5-mile exploratory tunnel to study the geology and hydrology. We know that because it's a volcanic tuff and there's fractures through the rock that it's going to leak. So that's why the titanium drip shields are part of your plan for the canisters that will be placed there. So that's what I'm saying. We've already have the information that shows it's not safe. So why are we going to waste another 30 years with 218 contentions by the state and lawsuits that I know I was part of as Attorney General against your department, or excuse me, against the Department of Energy, and instead of looking forward in a comprehensive approach and utilizing the science to help us understand and moving forward and the new technology that is out there. That's all I'm looking for, and I'd love the industry to come to the table and work with us on that, so thank you.
The key question at Yucca Mountain is not whether it's built in volcanic tuff, but whether it can or cannot comply with the very conservative environmental standards that were laid down to protect the health and safety of the public. And that's the question that would be resolved in a licensing hearing before fair, impartial, and qualified judges.
I disagree. But now that I have more time, let me add a little bit more to this. Because I think for purposes of science, we really are, and I would ask the scientists here, isn't the intent here to decrease any type of unexpected opportunities with respect to science? So you want a place that is safe, that you're going to decrease any vulnerabilities with respect to that deep geologic site, instead of adding to those vulnerabilities by man-made alleged safety barriers or natural safety barriers. You're going to decrease those kind of vulnerabilities. And isn't that what you're really looking for any type of site, a deep geologic site? And maybe, Mr. Fettis, I don't know if you have a response to that.
I couldn't agree more, Senator Cortez Masto. The idea behind any geologic repository is to find geologic media that can isolate the waste for the length of time it's dangerous. And the problem that the Yucca Mountain project has repeatedly run into is whenever it ran into the technical challenges that you so accurately described, the response was to weaken the standards to allow the site to be licensed. So we don't look at the upcoming Atomic Safety and Licensing Board proceeding, if it were to ever go forward, as a full exercise in having the state have a fair say.
If I could just add, since we were talking about drip shields, we do know that EPRI did an analysis back in 2008, and they found that the repository was capable of meeting the regulatory requirements without the drip shields, that they had sufficient defense in depth. The drip shields were designed simply as an additional redundant layer of protection. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Right, but still the drip shields are there as a redundant layer, and that's the point. And you're supposed to be reducing those types of additional redundancies, aren't you? You're supposed to be having the natural redundancies there and then adding them as necessary. So again, I'm all for moving forward. I think we have to have a solution here, and I think we have to be smart about it. This is waste that is going to be there for millions of years, for generations to come, for children, our grandchildren, and we've got to do right by them. And we have to be coming together, particularly in this country, to address this issue. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. And to our panel, we appreciate your contribution this morning. We all acknowledge that we have an issue that has been a longstanding issue that has not been resolved, and our effort will be to defy the skeptics and to change the status quo, which quite honestly has been going on for far too long. So I don't want Senator Risch to be sitting here in this committee 5 years from now in a similar hearing and saying, I remember back in 2019 we were talking about it and it was the same that it was when I first came to the committee. We've got an obligation. We've got good folks working on things. So let's try to address this very long-standing problem. With that, the committee stands adjourned.